Hi, we're back here with Dr. Jane Goldman in Mark chapter 11. And we're excited to go through this chapter because this chapter is Palm Sunday. Even though we're probably looking at this sometime in, October, November. We're not even thinking of Easter at the moment, but this is the triumphal entry, chapter 11. And we're so great that you're back here to talk with us again about your insights into the Gospel of Mark. So, chapter 11, what stood out to you and the main points here?
Okay, well, chapter 11 starts another new section. It's Jesus in Jerusalem, basically. And so the rest of his ministry occurs here. And as you said, it's the beginning of this week-long with what we celebrate now is Palm Sunday, where Jesus enters into the city and the people are singing his praises, Hosanna. They're putting the palm leaves and their cloaks on the road, and he's entering as king. But then it moves on to the cleansing of the temple. But that's kind of surrounded by this odd story of the fig tree and Jesus cursing the fig tree, and then it comes back to that at the end. So we can talk about that more a little bit later if you want.
Yeah.
But then he also is giving instructions to his disciples, and some about prayer, and then also he has some conflict with the leaders of the synagogue and the temple.
Conflict is putting it mildly. Yes.
And so so we see him instructions to the disciples, and also showing maybe the disciples how to deal with the religious leaders.
Well, I mean, and kind of looking at that as that, it was a very nice way of putting it. A small conflict with the leaders. I mean, this is the great and famous scene of Jesus flipping the tables, and some of you may have seen that on Facebook. The picture that says, when you're thinking about Jesus, just remember that flipping tables and cracking whips are well within the realm of possibilities. This is one of the few times where you see some strong emotion and anger, really. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. He was just so upset with how how God's house really has been defamed and turned into this den of robbers, as he said, as these merchants, a sale place. It's I think in some ways, in his view, not to try to speak for Jesus, but I think in some ways it cheapened everything that God is and the good news that he's talking about.
Yeah, and I noticed this time that he said, my house will be called a house of prayer. And I guess that's
for
just...
For all nations.
Yeah, for all nations. So the prayer and how Jesus regards prayer. I mean, it is his lifeline to God the Father. And this area, what I learned, this area where they were doing the buying and the selling was really called kind of like the court of the Gentiles. It was where the Gentiles were supposed to be permitted to pray. And he says the house for all nations. So, people were all carrying things and kind of just traipsing through with their goods and all. And so I think it was just this anger and this indignation that he had.
Well, and that and the example then also of what they're setting for the Gentiles.
Right.
And that's huge. I mean, that's huge. Even I think a lot of times I know in my faith walk that I forget that and something that you mentioned back when we were talking in chapter 1 about our lives being an aroma of Christ. Just how important that is. How important it is to be a walking, living testimony for folks, and that if you give a false testimony, how dangerous that can be.
Right.
I think a lot of unbelief that happens from people even today is because of false witness.
Oh, well, that's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, not to carry all the blame, but I mean, for sure. Yeah.
Well, and that if it's cheapening the place where the Gentiles are permitted, so they're kind of marginalized anyway, and we don't really care about their space or making it really sacred or holy for them.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know. I hadn't thought about that before, but this time, reading it, I did.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, let's talk about the famous scene here, and then maybe we'll touch on the fig tree there. I'd love to hear your insights on it. But obviously, the famous scene here in Mark 11 is the triumphal entry, what we celebrate on Palm Sunday. And it's interesting. I have heard it said that Easter actually is one of the only, or the week of Easter, Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, is one of the only times really that we can actually chart out chronologically what happened, and that it happens at this time of the month, Some people do research and they feel that Christmas was when Jesus was born was not necessarily during the December month as we celebrate. It may have been in another month, but Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday is always marked out at this time. And so it's just interesting that when we get into the Easter season to remember that we are celebrating something that 2000 and
That's amazing.
some odd years ago happened.
Yeah.
So what did you think of how do you look at Palm Sunday, at the triumphal entry? Anything stick out to you?
I guess not particular from this, except I hadn't noticed before in verse 11, it says Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. And I hadn't thought about that before, like what was he looking around at? But I think he might have been looking around at all the people there selling the things.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he came into Jerusalem. Yeah, then he comes back in again.
Yeah.
So, I didn't see that. Yeah, that is interesting. Where he where he took it all in, and maybe for the sake of everyone in there, Jesus said, "I'm going to pause a second and not say anything for right now."
Because it was already late.
Right.
But you know how you stew about something overnight,
Oh, yeah.
and then the next morning, bam! Yeah. Well, that may just be what.
I wonder. Yeah, I never thought about that, and actually, luckily for them, because I don't know if I'd want to see Jesus that upset in the moment. Right.
I know.
Yeah. So that's actually a neat scene. Okay, and now the fig tree. So what's going on with this weird story?
I don't really know, but this is kind of what I could come up with. Is that it is basically a story about judgment. So he curses this fig tree because it didn't have any fruit, and he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples overheard him, and then it's kind of left. And then we see this big turmoil in the temple where Jesus is judging the behavior that is going on in the temple.
Right.
And then after that, it comes back to the fig tree. And in the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." So all I know is that it's a story of judgment, and it kind of goes along with the judgment in the temple. That's the best I can come up with, but I'm looking forward to learning more about that.
I think I'd be inclined to agree in terms of like he looks at the scene in the temple, they leave, he sees the tree is supposed to have fruit, it does not, and he decides to curse it and say, "May you never and ever eat from you again." In terms of that the temple is not producing fruit and you have pretty much forsaken what it is you're supposed to do. And then in that way, and in a sense, Jesus removing the honor of being someone that can, a house of God that can produce that fruit. But it's interesting that his reply to Peter, though, if we look at verse 22, Jesus answered saying to them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen will be granted to him. Therefore I say to you, all things which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted to you." And so it doesn't have anything really to do other than with judgment in that regard. His answer is more or less that, if you pray and believe that it can be answered, it will, which doesn't really go along with the fig tree. So the fig tree is kind of like, it's just a little disjointed there, and maybe in your discussions with your small group you can dive into that yourselves as well.
Yeah, tell me if you come up with an answer.
Wonderful, yes.
Track me down in church and let me know what you think.
Great. So in that, did you see any difficult teachings in this chapter? I think we kind of talked around them already.
Well,
but anything specific you'd highlight?
Just the last verses you were talking about, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe and it will be done for you. Sometimes I think I don't truly believe what I'm praying. I mean, I do, but I'm not consciously, so that when the prayer is answered, I'm surprised.
Right.
And then I realize maybe I didn't really believe that it would happen.
Right.
So that, and then the second part of that, when it says, so I think it's linking effective prayer with faith.
Right.
Faith, and then with forgiveness. And so when it says, and when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. Ooh, I don't like that. I don't like the little word, so that
Right.
your Father in heaven. So I would like to rewrite that verse and say
Yes.
something like, for effective prayers, you need to forgive anyone you're holding a grudge against, just as the Father has forgiven you. I don't want the so that. I don't want God's forgiveness of me to be based on whether I forgive others. I want him to base it on the death of Jesus Christ, which I do
Right.
really believe.
Right.
But it's just a little bit of a difficult translation, maybe, or I don't know.
It could be, yeah, a difficult translation, or I mean, it
It's
really
so
could be
bad.
what is being said there in terms of that if we do harbor this unforgiveness for someone, that means that's a source of conflict. That means that something could have happened. And for some folks, that could be as simple as they cut you off in traffic, or as deep as like huge, deep-seated abuse that doesn't just get willy-nilly written
Right.
off.
Right.
But I think it's definitely a call to say that you can't harbor that hatred that in your heart, because I think in some ways it splits you a little bit.
Yeah.
And in James it talks about, a divided heart doesn't necessarily receive the wisdom from the Lord. I mean, so I think in some ways it's saying that you can't have that division like that. And also, your Father in heaven has the ability to forgive even the worst offender, so long as they had repented and
Right.
believed,
Yeah.
And so I think, if your Father's going to forgive you to the degree of your transgressions, the challenge is for you
Right.
to do the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh. Hard teachings. not always the greatest. And as always, as we end with each of our discussions, how does this chapter challenge us to walk in the ways of Jesus?
I think that the way Jesus was able to kind of navigate what I call the snarliness, the evil of this world, whether it's in the temple or what else did I see it in here? Oh, how the Pharisees tried to trick him with the question about, who gives you this authority, and we're told to be as innocent as doves and as shrewd as snakes. But that's a hard balance. But I see that in Jesus here. He's kind of my hero. He knows how to navigate and not become corrupt himself in the temple, or not to kind of stoop to the snarliness of the leaders of the church and just kind of straightforward answer them, but keep them in their place.
Right.
I just thought, he's brilliant.
Yeah.
I just love that. I love that. I need more of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jesus. Wonderful. Yes. Well, thank you again, Dr. Goldman. This has been wonderful to journey through some of these chapters with you. And if you see Jane Goldman, if you see her walking around at church, stop her, tell her that you saw her on camera. And if you have any questions, I'm sure she'd love to.
Yeah, I want to get your take on some of these
Yes,
things.
absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, as you guys get ready to have your discussions tonight, we definitely just wish you well, and may the Lord guide you and direct you as you go through chapter 11 of the Gospel of Mark.